I still remember the exact moment I thought, this might actually be the best decision I've made all year, because everything about that night felt right in a way I wasn't used to. The lighting in the restaurant was warm, the kind that made everyone look softer and more confident, and the quiet background music blended perfectly with the low hum of conversations around us. I was sitting there, hands wrapped around a glass of water, feeling that rare mix of nervous and excited that only happens when you allow yourself to hope again. This blind date wasn't something I'd planned for weeks or dreamed about for years. It was something I agreed to on a whim, pushed by friends who insisted I'd been single long enough and deserved to meet someone new. I didn't expect much going in, which somehow made what happened next even more shocking. When my date walked in, my first thought was relief. He smiled immediately, not the forced kind, but the kind that reaches your eyes, and it instantly put me at ease. He looked exactly like the photo I'd been shown, maybe even better in person, and when he said my name, it didn't feel awkward or rehearsed. It felt familiar, like we'd already met in another life. We ordered drinks, exchanged small talk, laughed about how strange blind dates are in general, and within minutes, the tension I usually carry into first dates completely disappeared. Conversation flowed effortlessly, jumping from funny childhood stories to deeper topics without that uncomfortable pause where both people pretend to check the menu. I remember thinking how rare that was, how usually I'm counting minutes, planning exits, or convincing myself to give it more time, but this time I didn't want the night to move too fast. As the evening went on, everything just kept getting better. He listened, really listened, leaning in when I spoke, asking follow-up questions, remembering small details I casually mentioned. We shared similar values, laughed at the same ridiculous things, and even discovered we had oddly specific things in common that felt too coincidental to ignore. At one point, I caught myself smiling for no reason, just sitting there watching him talk, and that scared me more than anything else. I hadn't felt that kind of ease with someone in a long time. It felt like the universe had finally decided to cut me a break. I remember thinking that if the night ended right then, I'd still walk away happy, because sometimes it's enough just to be reminded that connection like this still exists. By the time our food arrived, the date had shifted from casual to meaningful. We talked about past relationships, not in a bitter way, but honestly, acknowledging mistakes and lessons learned. He spoke about growth, about wanting something real, about being tired of pretending to be someone else just to impress people. Those words hit me harder than I expected, because I felt the same way. I'd spent so long guarded, so long telling myself I didn't need anyone, that hearing someone say out loud what I'd been quietly thinking made me feel seen. There was a moment where our conversation paused, not awkwardly, but comfortably, and we just looked at each other, smiling softly, like we both felt it too. That was the moment I thought, this could actually be something. I should have noticed the warning signs then. Maybe it was how perfectly his stories lined up, or how polished some of his answers sounded, but when you're caught in a good moment, you don't question it. You want to believe, you want to let yourself fall into the idea that this is finally your turn. So I ignored the tiny voice in my head that whispered caution and chose to stay present, to enjoy the night as it unfolded. We ordered dessert we didn't need, shared bites off the same plate, and joked about how ridiculous it was to meet someone like this through mutual friends instead of fate. I even remember thinking how excited I'd be to tell my friends that they were right. Then everything changed. It started with a sound I didn't recognize at first, a familiar laugh from somewhere behind me, followed by someone saying my name with surprise. I turned slightly, confused, and that's when I saw my neighbor standing just a few steps away from our table. We weren't close friends, but close enough to exchange conversations in the hallway, borrow sugar, complain about noise, and occasionally chat about life. Seeing him there wasn't completely strange, but the expression on his face was. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't relaxed. He was staring directly at my date with a look that stopped me cold. It was the kind of look that says recognition mixed with disbelief. Before I could even process what was happening, my neighbor stepped closer, eyes still locked on the person sitting across from me. The energy at the table shifted instantly. The warmth disappeared, replaced by a heavy silence that made my chest tighten. My date's posture changed too. His shoulders stiffened, his smile faded, and for the first time all night, he avoided eye contact. That alone would have been enough to make me uneasy, but what happened next is what shattered everything. My neighbor cleared his throat and asked a simple question. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't accusatory. It was calm, almost casual. But it landed like a bomb. He said, "Hey, aren't you the same person who," and then he paused, glanced at me, and finished the sentence with a question that instantly drained all the color from my date's face. I won't repeat the exact words here, but the implication was clear enough that I felt my stomach drop before my brain could catch up. The seconds that followed felt endless. My date didn't answer right away. He didn't laugh it off. He didn't deny it. He just sat there, staring at the table, jaw clenched, eyes darting like he was calculating his next move. My neighbor looked between us, clearly realizing he'd just walked into something much bigger than he expected, and suddenly I felt exposed, like I was the only person in the room who didn't know the truth yet. I asked what he meant, my voice quieter than I intended, and that's when the night officially unraveled. The explanation came slowly at first, piece by piece, like someone reluctantly pulling a thread they know will unravel everything. The person I'd been connecting with all night wasn't exactly who he claimed to be. There were details left out, stories adjusted, timelines blurred just enough to avoid detection. My neighbor knew him from a completely different context, one that contradicted everything I'd been told across that table. The more that was revealed, the more I felt the ground shift beneath me. What hurt the most wasn't just the lie. It was how intentional it all felt. The way he'd carefully shaped his words, how smoothly he'd answered my questions, how comfortable he'd seemed discussing honesty and growth while hiding something so significant. I replayed moments from earlier in the night in my head, realizing how certain things made sense now, how the cracks had been there all along, quietly waiting to be noticed. I felt embarrassed, not because of what happened, but because I'd allowed myself to believe so easily. The conversation ended awkwardly after that. My neighbor apologized, clearly uncomfortable, and left us sitting there in silence. My date tried to explain, to justify, to minimize, but the connection was gone. Whatever magic we'd built had evaporated, replaced by a heavy understanding that trust, once broken, doesn't come back easily. I listened, nodded, and eventually stood up, knowing the night was over even if neither of us said it out loud. Walking home alone, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Disappointment, yes, but also gratitude. Gratitude that the truth came out when it did, before feelings ran deeper, before I invested more time, more energy, more hope. One simple question, asked at the right moment, saved me from a much bigger heartbreak. That night taught me something I still carry with me. No matter how perfect something seems, the truth always finds its way to the surface. Sometimes it comes quietly, sometimes through someone unexpected, but it always arrives exactly when it needs to. Looking back now, I don't see that night as a failure. I see it as a reminder to trust my instincts, to pay attention to the small voice inside me, and to remember that real connection doesn't need deception to survive. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: sometimes the most important moments in our lives are triggered by a single question we never saw coming.